Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on rendering and VR. I want to thank everyone for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedules to learn a little bit about Envisioneer. We're going to be going through all of the different settings that are involved in making a really good rendering with Envisioneer. And then we're going to be talking about going into a virtual reality mode and how to get there and how to attach to it. Following the class, I'm going to open up the chat panel for questions that you might have on rendering and VR. And then following that, I'm going to email all of you out a booklet so you can read about all of the different settings we talked about today and go over them point by point in your own examples to learn even more. So without further ado, let's get started in learning a little bit, first of all, about creating a rendering in Envisioneer. When you're creating a rendering in the software, there's three different things that you should pay attention to in your models. One is lighting, two are the materials that you've chosen, and three are the settings that you're going to choose when you start to create that rendering. So we're going to go through all of those 3 points and give you the best solutions for creating a great model and rendering in the software. So first of all, let's look at lighting and the lighting that's in a scene. The example you can see on my screen right now is an interior rendering. And that interior rendering has a mix of interior lights. There's some pendant lights and a recessed light. And it also has lights that are coming in naturally through the windows. So when you're creating a rendering, you have to think about those lights, how they are emitting light into the scene. And if there's too many lights, maybe it's too bright in the scene, or if there's not enough light in the scene, it could be very dark. And that can have different effects on your rendering as well. I'm first of all going to click on one of the lights that I've inserted, this little pendant light over the island here, and I'm going to right click on that light. When I'm looking at that light itself, I do have some options right off the bat, and one of them that's going to be helpful is lights on, lights off. If you find that when you're creating a rendering, you want to be able to show the lights that are in the space because you want to show the fixture. But with all of the lights on, the potential lights that are in a room, it's way overwhelming with much too much light in the room, and it looks very washed out. You might want to turn off the light itself. So the light isn't illuminating in the space, but you get to still see the pendant fixture there. So I can turn the light off. And when I turn the light off, you can see that it no longer illuminates on top of the little breakfast bar area here. So again, select the fixture that you want to check, right-click, lights on, lights off to turn them on and off again. But there's other properties in this light that will also have an effect on how it's going to illuminate in the space and add light into our rendering. So again, with that light selected, if I right-click, I can look at the properties of this light. And under the properties of this light, I can see, first of all, the size of the light fixture itself if I want to change any of those that information. And then two, here under the Lights tab is really the pertinent information when I'm looking at rendering that I want to look at today during our class. This Lights tab will show me the actual light source that I've chosen for this pendant light and give me the ability to change it out if I want to grab a different wattage of bulb as an example, or change the brightness percentage. So here under lights, the first thing I have is brightness percentage, and it's at 100%. So whatever light source I've chosen below, the 60-watt incandescent chandelier light, I can dim it down or up with this brightness percentage. So think of that as almost like a dimmer switch that you can bring down and bring up the intensity of that 60-watt bulb. As a default, all the lights in the catalog are left at 100%, so you can see them at their full intensity. But again, if you want to be able to show a light, finding that it's a little bit too bright, this is a way to come in and tweak that light source so it brings down that intensity by adjusting the brightness percentage. You can see I've got the 60-watt incandescent chandelier, and the eye is wide open beside that light. This is another way of turning lights on, lights off. So in effect, when I right-clicked earlier and chose lights off, it was coming into this dialog box and closing this eye for me. So I didn't have to come all the way into the dialog box. And when I would choose lights on, it would come into this portion of the dialog box again and open the eye, so that light source is on. To the right, you can see that I can add further lights. So if this was a multi-bulb light, I can add as many bulbs in here as I want to by hitting the Add button, and multiple bulbs would be added into this particular light source. Or I can edit the light that's here. So I'm going to choose Edit. And that will bring me into a dialog box that's going to show me all of my light sources that are available. For those of you that are used to working with lighting files and have worked with them in the past, you'll be happy to know that these are IES files that you can get from lighting manufacturers. They produce them, and an IES file is going to show you exactly how that particular light bulb is going to illuminate in a 3D model. So we're using that same type of technology in Envisioneer. So if you have used IES files, you can bring them in simply by right-clicking in here and telling it that you want to add a light. So each of these light sources has information behind them as well to tell them how to illuminate. I'm going to right-click on the 60-watt bulb and tell it that I want to edit the light so I can show you that information. So you can see that this 60-watt light bulb is an IES file. Like I told you before, if you've never worked with IES files, no worries. You don't have to have a knowledge of them for today's class or when you're rendering. It's just a manufacturer file format that they created to produce this light. And then we loaded in that IES file that we got from the manufacturer of GE. Each light can also have a color associated to it. So you can see that this particular 60-watt bulb has a peachy kind of a tone light to it. So when it's creating the rendering in the room, it's going to have a warmer glow to it, a more natural light look to it. But if you want to have an actual light color, you can change that to a bright white or any color that you want to kind of give it that kind of a glow, that more natural feel. But this peachy color does give it that nice natural look to it. And this light source can cast shadows with it as well. If I wasn't loading in an IES file, you can see that we have properties below that allow you to change the light source itself. So I could say the number of lumens that this light has and the spotlight cone angle that it's going to have as well. So you can get very specific on your lighting and exactly show how that particular light fixture is going to produce light for you. But for those of you that aren't used to working with lighting files, no worries whatsoever. The lights that we have in our catalog have been set up just for you, so you don't have to worry about coming in this deep and looking at it. But if you do want to dive in deeper and play with the lighting, you can certainly come in here and create your own lighting files in different colors to affect the overall light as well. So again, every light fixture is going to have this lights tab in its properties, and that'll allow us to play with how bright it is if we want to dim them down or turn on and off the light altogether, or even swap out and change the type of bulb that it's using. So instead of a 60-watt incandescent chandelier, maybe we'll want a 100-watt bulb in there, and we can play with those. Also very important is the light's position. I'll bring your attention where my mouse is moving in the little profile here of the light fixture. And in there, the little preview of what that light is going to look like, you can see that there's like a little red puck underneath the light. That's where the actual light is going to start glowing from. So think of that as our light bulb. The reason that I have this one sitting down lower than my light fixture is if it was sitting and residing inside that light fixture, the light would illuminate inside the fixture and not glow outside of it. So I always move it down a little bit lower than the light fixture so it has the opportunity to glow and spread out beyond the actual light fixture itself. So if you're ever bringing in your own lights and wondering why it's not glowing or it's not as bright as it should be, you can change the light position. So you can see this Z value here at the very bottom. I brought it down 2 feet and 1 3/4 of an inch, so it's sitting down below the actual fixture itself, and it has a chance to illuminate. So you can play with that and bring the light level up and down in its position. So maybe if it's too close to a surface and you're noticing it's kind of washing out the surface, you can bring that back up and move that light source up as you need to. You can also tilt the light's orientation. So if you wanted to spotlight something, maybe it's a picture on a wall, you can tilt the light and direct it to illuminate a certain area. And that can be really effective, again, when you're thinking about artwork on a wall or something that you want to profile and shed some light on so that it becomes kind of the focal point of your rendering. You can do that by tilting the light up and down and left and right and show the number of degrees that you want to do it by. So lights can play that dramatic role. If it's too light and you're not shedding enough light into a space, then you might want to change the light source. Or if there's too much light in the space, you might even want to turn it off altogether. So I'm going to hit cancel out of here. And each one of the light fixtures that you see in the room, they have those exact same properties. So whether it be the pendants or this recessed light here at the top of the sink, it'll have that same lights tab. Again, so I could just select it, right-click, and look at its properties, or even in my right-click menu, turn that light on and off if I need to. The other type of light that is in our space is the natural light that's going to flow through the windows and the doors, any kind of glass that we have, and it's going to bring in the sunlight into our space. So how do we affect the settings of the sunlight? Well, if you go down to the very bottom of your screen and look at the different view modes that you have, you can view your model in a number of different ways. One is in the rendered view, which is the normal view when you go into 3D view that you look at. But we also have this realistic view, and that turns on the lights like you can see in my scene. So I can see some sunlight coming in and filtering down in front of these cabinets. I can see my recessed light throwing some light down over top of the window, and same with the light that's illuminating on top of my breakfast bar area from the pendant lights above. If I right-click in the scene, it brings up options. Anytime you're using any kind of tool in Envisioneer, right-clicking will always bring up options. So even if it's this empty space, I'm not in a particular tool right now, I'm just looking at my scene. If I right-click, it will give me the options that I have for this particular view that I'm looking at. And one of the things I want to look at are the scene properties. What are the properties of this particular scene I'm looking at? When I click on scene properties, you'll notice that what was my catalog panel to the right of my screen has now updated with scene properties. So when I'm looking at the scene properties, there's a number of different properties that we have in here, looking at the lighting that we're using. Is this particular scene looking at the actual accurate lighting of the space? If that's checked, it will kind of slow your system down. If you're using maybe an older video card or don't have a lot of RAM, it could potentially slow you down to use the actual lighting in the space. You also have a date and time, and that's obviously going to affect where the sun is positioned and coming through the windows. So I've set mine into October to get that late autumn sunlight coming through, and I've set it for late in the day. So when the light's coming and filtering in the windows, you can see it's got a lower level of light and it's coming through the window. If you play with the date and the time, you'll notice that those shadows are going to change. So that's something you can play with on your own models. Go into the scene properties, start changing the time and date, and watch that sun change, and that will affect your shadows. And those are the same shadows it's going to produce when you create a photorealistic rendering. So this is almost like a preview for you of where those shadows are going to hit. You don't have to go through the whole rendering process and hope that you've got the time of day right. This gives you that preview to the shadows that are going to be produced at that time, at that day. So I like to look at that setting. The other setting that's going to affect my renderings, if I come down to the very bottom here, is sky settings. Is it partly cloudy sky? Is it overcast? Is it a clear sky? So that when it is sending down the sun rays into my space, is it partly cloudy or is it a clear sky? And then I'm going to have even more sunlight filtering through and into my space as well. So you can adjust those things, and that will affect the sunlight that's coming through your space. And that ultimately has an effect on your rendering and how everything is looking with the lights that are in the space. So let's recap lighting before we go on to materials. when you're looking at creating a rendering, one key factor in that rendering and the overall look at the very end are the lights that are in that space. And that lighting can be artificial lighting that you bring into the space, recessed lights, pendant lights, lamps. They're all going to illuminate. And by looking at the actual lights themselves, they'll all have properties behind them on the Lights tab that will allow you to change the wattage of the light, how bright it is, change down that intensity of the light, tilt the light, direct that light in a certain location, bring down where the light is starting to illuminate, or bring it back up if it's too intense as well. We also have, if I right-click in the scene, the ability to look at scene properties in the space, and the scene properties are going to allow us to change the date and the time so we can affect the shades and shadows that are going to come into the space. Moving on now to materials, I'm going to click on the Material Paintbrush tool, and that's this tool that I'm hovered over right now underneath the Building tab, the second tool in. When I click on that particular tool, you'll notice that my catalog panel now to the right of my screen updates with various materials. And in our scene, we have a number of different materials, from the hardwood flooring to the painted gray cabinets to the paint on the wall to the hard surface material we've used for the countertop and the backsplash. Each one of those materials are going to have unique properties behind them to say, am I a glossy finish? Am I a dull finish? What's going to happen to me when light shines on me? Am I going to reflect that light out, or am I going to absorb that light? So I'm going to go over to my materials catalog and click on this Materials Eyedropper tool. And then I'm going to click on one of the gray colors, the gray cabinet color in my scene. And that takes me down to a Benjamin Moore paint color called Ashland Slate. I'm going to right-click on Ashland Slate in my materials catalog and edit that material to look at the properties of that particular material. Each material will have a material property dialog box behind it that's driving how it's going to appear in your scene. That material can either be a solid color or it can be an actual texture, a JPEG or a bitmap image that you're using to portray that particular finish. So right now we have a JPEG that's a gray swatch that's showing us that Ashland Slate color for our cabinetry. What we're really interested in when we're looking at this particular material properties dialog box in regards to rendering is the very bottom of the screen. And it's the rendering effects that we want to look at. Each material has rendering effects that are going to show how this material is going to look when you take it through a rendering process. The first option that you see there is specular. Another way of thinking about specular is glossiness. Is this a glossy paint color or is it a dull paint color? And the more specular it is, the more glossy it's going to get. So you can bring that all the way up. But buyer beware. I've seen many renderings come in where everyone thinks, oh, I want everything to look glossy and clean and to be reflective. But the more reflective and glossy everything looks, it can have a really watery look to the rendering, and everything could look washed out because everything is so glossy it looks really fake. So I always recommend that the highest value that you have here for specular is 15%. And it should only be one item in your room that is that glossy. So if you want people to really look at the flooring or really look at the cabinetry, that should be your one item that is 15%. Everything else should be much lower than that, so it's not over intense and everything is way too glossy. We're going to keep our cabinets at 0%, and we're going to make sure that our countertops are going to be our highest, glossiest finish, and we'll make that our highest value later. Emissive means that does it emit light from it? You may have certain materials that you want to emit light. So as an example, if I look back to our scene and I'm looking at our pendant lights that are hanging, maybe they're a material, a fabric, and that fabric in that light I want to illuminate to make it look like the actual light bulb is inside that light fixture and it's illuminating. I could make that material, that fabric, that lampshade, illuminate by changing it up to have an emissive value. And then it's going to look like it's going to be nice and bright and light is coming out of it. You can also take advantage of emissive for fireplaces. So if you want it to look like the picture that you're using of a fire in a fireplace is actually emitting light like the fire would, you can give that picture of the fire wood an emissive value so it looks like it's emitting light. I've also done an emissive value on ceiling surfaces as well. If I don't want to have any lights in the scene, I want to make it look like it's nice and clean on the ceiling, no light fixtures are hanging, I can put an emissive value on the paint color on the ceiling so it looks like it's bright. So the whole ceiling is a white color that's really bright and white, and it looks like it's a little bit emissive. And that's a way of giving that clean line look, but still getting kind of light into the space. The last option you see there is transparency. When we're dealing with something like the paint color on the cabinets, we obviously want it to be 0% transparent. And if it was the glass in the door, we'd want that to be 100%. And if you're using glass block, maybe you want it to be 75%, so you can kind of see through it, but not really. And you can play with the transparency of the various materials as well. So you can see how these are very important when we're looking at renderings, because it's going to look at every material that you have in the space. And when you look at that material, it's going to say, is it specular? Is this supposed to be glossy? And here it will say, nope, it's 0%. Is it emissive? Nope, it's 0%. Is it transparent? Nope. Show it as it is. Give me that gray color. And then it goes on to the next material. And maybe it's slightly glossy. So then it has to think of when the light is emitting on that surface and it's slightly glossy, how is it going to reflect out? And if that reflects over to another material that could be glossy as well, how is that going to reflect out as well? So these are very important settings and can have a dramatic effect on your renderings. If you're finding that everything's too washy, then you probably have got too high of a specular values on all of your various materials, trying to make them all very glossy, and it looks too washed out. The default material settings that we have in the catalog that ships with your Envisioneer software has a pretty good value for all of these different materials that you can use in the catalog. But again, play with them. Find the ones that are right for you. You might find that on our countertops we only used 2%, but you'd like to see them a little glossier and pump that up to maybe 10%. So you've got that opportunity in all of these settings that are in the space. I'm going to click on the material paintbrush, and I'm going to click on the eyedropper itself, go back over to my scene, click on the countertop material, and now in my catalog panel to the right, it's going to source down the material that I used for the countertops and show it to me and highlight it. So I can see that under the countertops hard surface group, I used countertop 25 in the scene. So if I right-click on countertop 25, I can edit its material. And when I'm looking at its material, I can change those same rendering settings. So I'm going to make it slightly specular here. We're going to bring that down to about 8%. So you can see the glossiness when we're done here. Okay, and then I'm going to click OK, and that'll update those material properties. Okay, so two things to look at when you're rendering. One was the lighting that we first looked at. How intense is that lighting? What direction is that lighting? Is that light on or off? And then the materials that that light is going to hit. What happens when that material, when that light hits that material? If it's an emissive value, it's going to bring out light as well. Or is it a glossy finish, and is it going to reflect the light out of it? The last thing that we have to look at when we're creating the renderings are the settings behind the renderings themselves as well. So I'm going to go up to the View pull-down menu at the very top of the screen, and I'm going to change and select to Render 3D Real View. And the 3D Real View dialog box will appear and give me a little preview of what my rendered view is going to look like. In this view, because I had the realistic view on, you can see the light illuminating from each one of the fixtures and the sunlight coming in from the window itself. But there are more settings to look at. I'm going to draw your eye to the lower left corner of this dialog box where my cursor is hovering over the Options button, and I'm going to click on Options. That'll bring up the Program Settings dialog box that's specifically pointing to and looking at right now the 3D Real View settings. There's a number of different settings in here that we can change and play with to create a photorealistic rendering. The very first one that you see there is the level, the ray trace quality. You'll notice we have level 1 all the way to level 5. Level 1 being the lowest, level 5 being the highest. But beside both of those options, you can see in brackets level 1 is the fastest and level 5 is the slowest. The lowest level is obviously going to be quicker to produce. It's just going to give a general light level from each of the fixtures and produce it as quickly as it can. Where level 5 is going to track down more rays of light coming from those fixtures so it can more accurately see where all of those various rays are going to hit and illuminate and create the reflections that it needs. So level 5 will give you a very high quality realistic rendering, but obviously it's going to take a longer time to look at each light source, each ray that's coming through it, and how it's bouncing off each particular material. When you're looking at fastest to slowest, another thing to keep in mind about creating a rendering and how long it's going to take is the amount of geometry that's in your actual file as well. So if you're working on a small room and that room might be 20 by 20, you don't have a lot of items in the room, maybe it's just 4 walls, 2 windows, and a table in the middle, that's obviously going to render much quicker than a 10,000 square foot home with all of the furnishings in it and all of the cabinetry in it and all of the light fixtures in it. The bigger the model, the more elements that you place in the model, the longer it's going to take, because the rendering has to look at each individual element. Do I reflect light? Do I absorb light? How am I going to play with the lights that are coming in on this particular material? Even if that object isn't in the room, it still has to consider it. So I'm standing in my kitchen for our rendering, but behind me might be the living room. And there might be a shadow cast by an object in the living room that's going to affect the space. So it has to look at the other rooms as well. So if you're dealing with a very large model, it's a large home, it's got lots of great details into it, you put a lot of work into putting all of the furnishings in so it looks really great. What you might want to do before you render it is save a copy of that model. So you go up to File, Save As, and call it Model for Rendering. And then go into the kitchen and do a rendering of the kitchen by gutting everything else out of that model. The only room left standing is the kitchen. So it doesn't have to consider the 25 other rooms that are on that floor when it's creating that rendering. That's a quick tip to if you're in a time crunch and you need to create a really good rendering, high level, level 5, but you know you've got this massive model on your hands and you know it's going to take time, save a copy. Gut the copy just down to that one room that you want to render and run the rendering of just that one room. And then when you've got the rendering done, then you can go on to the next room and just keep making copies of the model for the various renderings that you're going to do, just to save yourself some time. I always do a low-level rendering to begin with, just so I can test out that everything looks good in the rendering before I commit to a high-level, level 5. In our model that I have today, it's just a kind of a one-room model. The low level would probably take less than a minute, but even at the highest level, it'll probably take only a few minutes to create. That being said, in this type of environment using GoToMeeting and everyone tuned into my screen, it's going to slow my computer down as well. If I have 10 different applications open, I'm using GoToMeeting, everything is taxing the memory on my computer and my video card, and that's going to slow me down as well. So when you go to do a rendering, make sure you shut everything else down so it can produce it as efficiently as possible. So for today's class, I'm just going to do a low level. Know the quality can get much better, but with everybody, taxing in and looking at my screen, I don't want to slow us down too much. The next setting we have there is called anti-aliasing. If you take a look out at a scene and are looking at the edges of any type of object, they're going to have a slightly jagged appearance to them. Depending on your video card, that could be quite apparent. It could be very jagged looking, or it could be smooth looking, but it's a little bit jagged. What anti-aliasing is going to do is it's going to smooth out all of those edges and make them look more natural, so they're not so jagged and they don't look like computer generated. So the higher the value, the harder it's going to work to kind of crease out those seams that you have. Level 5 is the highest and level 1 is the lowest. For today's class, I'll keep that kind of mediocre at 3 because, again, when it's doing this process, it is a process, so it's another time investment into the rendering as well. Down below that, you'll see some settings here for noise reduction, electrical lights, and skylight noise reduction. Think of this when you have light streaming down from the light sources that we've put into the space, our pendant lights, our recessed light, and then light streaming through the window from our natural light. When those two meet, those two different types of light, they can give a kind of a speckled, grainy effect. So you'll notice that the materials that they're meeting on kind of look speckled. Because I'm on a low level and I'm going to keep this noise reduction down to 1, we'll see that in my sample rendering when we're done, so I can point that out to you. So if you've noticed a lot of pixelated area in your rendering, pump up the noise reduction. It's just when those two light sources are meeting that you're going to want to deal with the noise for both the electrical lights in the space and any skylights that you might have in the space as well. Then we have tree and billboard intensity. So when you put in a tree in the space and it's just a billboard tree, or you use our billboard command to bring in a picture maybe of your homeowners so it looks like they're standing in the space, or a dog, or any kind of billboard that you're bringing in, how intense do you want the outline to appear against the rendering itself? The 35% we have set here is a good normal. But if you find that the billboards kind of have an outline to them, or they're looking a little bit too intense in the space, this is where you can adjust them so that it's going to back them down so that outline isn't too harsh. The last setting that you have here is just for the presentation mode that we go into when we go into the VR mode. It doesn't have any effect on our 3D renderings that we're going to produce, but it does have an effect on when we go into the interface of the presentation mode, if it's how dense a density it is. So depending on your video card, you might want to slow this down or speed it up with that intensity. But again, it doesn't have an effect on your renderings. This last value has nothing to do with rendering. It's more the presentation mode that we're going to go into later to talk about VR. Okay, so I'm going to click OK here to accept those settings, and then I'm going to hit Start Render. And when it starts the rendering process, it's going to first of all look at the global illumination of the space. Where are all the light sources that it has to deal with? There's 4 different lights in the room. There's sunlight coming in through the windows. So it's passing over and looking at all of the lighting. And then it does a ray trace portion. The ray trace portion looks at those light sources and softens them so that it doesn't look too computer generated. It gives all of the lights more of a natural appearance. So it's a 2-part process when it's looking at the lighting. One, that global illumination, where are all my light sources, how are they coming into the space, and then part 2, softening that light. You'll also notice, and I'm going to point this out, I'll just kind of highlight it here with a pen. Let me just grab a pen. And when I'm looking right here, see that noise that's happening right along there as I'm getting light from the different light sources in the room and the lights coming through the window? I'm going to get that noise that's going to happen in there. And that's the pixelated look that I'm talking about. And again, if you increase the value of that noise reduction, that's going to decrease all of that noise that's happening there. You can see that the render is already complete. It was done in a minute. So if I didn't have all of you on the line, it would have been completed in less than a minute. So the level 1 is very quick and efficient. And it gives me an okay rendering. It's not so bad, other than I have these kind of pixelated areas here where the light sources are kind of blending together. You also have options to play with this rendering once it's produced. Underneath the options here on the left-hand side, you'll see brightness. If I pump up the brightness in here, you'll notice that the room is going to get brighter and brighter. So if there isn't a lot of light sources in the space, you can still play with how bright the space is. The next one that we have is burn. So if I had a light and it was illuminating, let's suppose these lights, they're going right on top of this breakfast bar. And they were so intense and they were so bright that it was actually looking like they were burning into that material. You can take down the burn factor on here so that they don't look so intense. The last one you have is gamma, and it's again like brightness. Think of it like brightness as well, but this is also going to change kind of the tonal value of the overall scene as well. So by playing with these three, even when your rendering is complete, like it's saying above, the render's complete in a minute and a second, you can still play with those values. You can also convert it to a grayscale. So I can take that colored image and bring it down into just a gray tone value, or uncheck that, and now I have all of the actual materials that I used in the space. I can save this, and when I save it, I can save it as a JPEG or a bitmap. And when you're saving it as a JPEG, that's because you're going to want to use it on any kind of emailed rendering that you're going to send out to a client or on your website. And when you save it as a bitmap, that means you're going to want to print it out. JPEG has a looser pixel count to it, so even though your eye might not see it right away, it's going to load quicker on a website, whereas a bitmap is a heavier pixelated view, and it's much closer, it's much more accurate, but it takes a long time to bring that up on a website. So you always want to make sure you have JPEGs for a website. So when you do the save, you'll have the opportunity in the Save dialog box to save it as a JPEG or save it as a bitmap. What's the audience? Where are you going to be using this? That's where you'll save it as a JPEG or a bitmap. And then once that's done, you can, and here's where I would save it as a JPEG or a bitmap, and then it's done from there. Once I'm done, I can reset the values so I can create my next rendering. Perhaps I want to go through now that I'm happy with it, play with my options, and go from there to set them to higher values. So that is rendering and the effects that it can have and everything that goes into a rendering, the lighting, the materials, and the settings. The next option that we were going to talk about is going into a presentation mode, and when we go into that presentation mode, going into VR. When I go into presentation mode, and especially over GoToMeeting, it's going to wipe out all of my controls. So you may be able to see this, and I'm hoping you can. The conversion over to presentation mode, it basically takes my screen and takes away all of the commands that I have around it. All the toolbars will be flushed out, and I'll be able to hit the Oculus setting so that I can go into virtual reality mode. And that's all there is to it. If you have an HTC Vive or an Oculus headgear set and plugged into your computer, you'll instantly go into the VR mode. The only issues you're ever going to have on going into that Oculus mode with the HTC Vive or the Oculus is if your computer can't handle it. There are very specific computer needs for using Oculus and HTC Vive. You can't use it on a regular laptop. You can't use it on an older desktop unit. It really calls heavily on your video card, and there are very specific video cards that work well with VR and work with those two different headgears from HTC Vive and Oculus. And part of today's packet of information that I'm going to send you on rendering, I will include specifications for having an Oculus setup. So your computer specs that you'll need to be able to run these efficiently. Don't think that you can run an Oculus or an HTC Vive system on your regular laptop. It can't happen. It needs a higher end video card, and a lot of RAM pushed to it to make that run. So I'll send you in today's packet the specifications for the computer that you're going to need to run it. Once you're into that Oculus setting, you can navigate around with the arrow keys on your keyboard to move you front and back and side to side. Or included with Oculus is a PlayStation gaming controller so that you can navigate around with the gaming controller. If you're using the HTC Vive, it comes with paddles, and those paddles will allow you to move and navigate through the scene as well. But both systems, the HTC Vive and the Oculus, will allow you to use your keyboard and use the arrow keys to navigate as well. But both come with navigational systems, so you can use the little gaming controller that comes with the Oculus or the paddles that come with the HTC Vive to navigate around the scene. But I've been talking a fair bit today, and what I want to do is make sure that I answer all of the questions that you might have about rendering and the material settings we went over, the lighting settings we went over, and the basic rendering that we went over as well. So what I'd like to do now is open up the chat panel. So if you do have any questions on any of the settings that we went over today, make sure you post them up into the GoToMeeting console. You'll notice a place there where you can type in a question. I am the only person that can see those questions, so if you hesitate to ask a question because you don't want to put yourself out there in front of a crowd, you're not. I'll only see who's asking the questions, and I really feel that any question is a great question. What you're thinking about asking, somebody else is also thinking about asking, and all the questions help everyone learn all of the rendering controls that much better. So never ever hesitate in our classes to ask any questions about any of the settings. So let's go to our questions just to see what everyone's asking. And everybody's hesitating. There's no questions up there right now. So that either means that everybody fully understands what I presented to you today, and you've got a good understanding now of the lighting settings, the material settings, and the rendering settings, and you're ready to play with it and go and try changing those values to see the effects it's going to have on a scene, or I was completely over your heads and you don't even know where to start asking a question. So I'm hoping it's the first one, and I'm hoping it's not that you're too shy. But if it is the case where it was just a bit too much, you want to kind of absorb everything, I do record every class, and it will be put up in our webinar archive, so you'll be able to watch today's class again to really look at all of those settings and listen to me again talk about all of the various options that you have. And I'm also going to be emailing you out a booklet so you can read about all of those different settings as well to get a good handle on all of the different options you have for creating a really good rendering. Once you have a good understanding of materials and lighting and those rendering settings, you'll be able to achieve the same quality of rendering that you find on our gallery on our website. Those were all created in our software and all at that level 5 rendering with a good understanding of the materials that are in the space. Once you start playing more with those materials and the lights, you'll see exactly how they affect each other, and you'll be creating great renderings too. But there is one question that just popped in. I'm glad that came up. In Scene Properties, there's a Background tab. Can we make our own 3D backgrounds, and how? Yes. When we're looking at the Scene Properties, so I'm just going to get back into there for you now. So I'm going to right-click and look at the Scene Properties. There's two different types of backgrounds that you can have. You can see that right now I'm using a 2D image. So I did that purposely because I'm in the inside. I want to see this particular view from my window, so I just used a 2D image of a forested scene. But you can also have a 3D image. And a 3D image is what we would call a skybox. And a skybox takes a picture and brings it over top of the entire image so that it's going on all 4 sides. So if I look at our images and our 3D images here, it'll take me into our catalog where I can choose a skybox. And the skyboxes themselves are a picture that's kind of been pieced together of 4 different sides. So we'll have our left side, our right side, the upper side, and the backward side. So you can see these sky boxes. So you can see that we have a left and a right, up and down kind of. So it's going to take the sky box and wrap it around our 3D model, around the box of our model itself. So those you'll find out on the internet, different skyboxes. If you even just do a Google search on skyboxes, you'll be able to find many different skyboxes. Or if you take one of the ones that we've created, like the cloud water box or the cloudy sky, and use it as the framework for an image that you want to bring in, you can use this same outline to create your own skybox. That would be the best way to do it because we have the right proportions here. Rather than trying to create your own, use the one that we have here and edit the scene that's in the middle. To do that, you would need to use some photo editing software like Photoshop, Adobe's Photoshop, to be able to create those skyboxes. Great question. Where do I find the webinar archive? Another good question. I'm going to take you to our website, www.cadsoft.com. And when you're up on our website, you're going to come to this little hamburger pull-down menu and go to our Learning Center. And when you get to our Learning Center, you're going to go to our Events page. So it's Events and Training, just how the same place where you registered for today's class, Events and Training. And there, that'll bring up the types of training that we create and our calendar. And if you look below and to the right of the calendar, if I scroll down here for you, you'll see Webinar Archive. And you'll notice my cursor hovering over Access Webinar Archive. That is a link. That link takes you to a page where you can view all of the past performances that we've had on our Tuesday classes. So up there now is another rendering class that we've done in the past, and today's class will replace that one that's currently up there. These are also housed up on YouTube as well, but here is your quick access to find all of the past classes. These are really great ways to learn. A little nugget of information, half an hour, 45-minute class for you to understand how do I get started, how do I draw those walls, how do I watch this, all of these webinars to get that little gamut of information out of each one. So come up here and you'll find them, and today's class will be posted under rendering. It just takes about 24 hours to get the recording processed and placed up there. So give us about 24 hours for today's class to replace that one up there. And that seems to be the only questions up there. I'll leave that the screen up here now. We'll keep the class open for another moment, and unless there's no other questions, and then we will end today's class. And again, following today's class, I will send you an email out directly. It will have a little booklet attached to it on the settings that we went over today, and I'll also include with that the settings that you need if you're going to use a VR directly with Envisioneer. You need some very specific computer requirements for that, so I'll make sure I send that to you as well, a link to where it is on our website that you can find it. Okay, that seems to be all of the questions that are up there for today's class. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you learned a little bit about rendering and VR mode in the software and that you can use it in your upcoming projects. I look forward to seeing you in next week's class. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.